Hello, so today we're talking about the ventricular system of the brain, circulation of liquor, and hydrocephalus. And for this exam topic, you also have to know how to draw a rough scheme of the ventricular system of the brain. So, as you know by now, we have some fluid that circulates around the brain and the spinal cord, and this is called cerebrospinal fluid. It's also called liquor. So basically, the ventricular system of the brain is just the system of cavities that we call ventricles that they're responsible for producing, circulating, and clearing out that cerebrospinal fluid. So, what does the ventricular system consist of? We can talk about the ventricles it's composed of and the ducts connecting them together. So we have 4 ventricles, that is 2 lateral ventricles, one located in each lobe. So we have a right and a left ventricle. Then we have the 3rd ventricle and the 4th ventricle. So this is just a diagram of the ventricles on a dissection of the brain to give you an idea of where they're located. Like we said, we have the lateral ventricle, we have the 3rd ventricle, and the 4th ventricle. Now we're going to talk about each ventricle in a bit more depth. So starting off with the lateral ventricles. So the lateral ventricles, as we already said, we have 2 of them, one located in each cerebral hemisphere. They are C-shaped and they're the largest out of the ventricles. Also important to know is that these lateral ventricles have 3 projections called horns, and they're named based on their location. So it's pretty easy. We have the frontal horn in blue, we have the occipital horn, and then the temporal horn. And then what's left of the lateral ventricles is called the body of the lateral ventricles. Finally, these lateral ventricles are then connected with the 3rd ventricle through the interventricular foramen of Monro. Finally, we have to talk a bit about the borders of the lateral ventricles. So medially, they are separated by septum pellucidum. Laterally, they're just surrounded by some cerebral tissue. Then superiorly, we have the tela choroidea, and inferiorly is the thalamus. So the next ventricle is the 3rd ventricle. We already talked about its connection with the lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramen of Monro. And this 3rd ventricle then connects with the 4th ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. So the borders of the 3rd ventricle, a bit about them. The roof is the tela choroidea. Anteriorly, we have the lamina terminalis. Inferiorly is the hypothalamic sulcus. Laterally, we have the medial walls of the right and left thalami, and finally, posteriorly is the posterior commissure. Now, the last ventricle is the 4th ventricle. We already said it connects with the 3rd ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. Now, the 4th ventricle is located a bit more inferiorly at the level of the brainstem, and specifically, it's located at the junction between the pons and the medulla oblongata. So, and a bit about the borders of the 4th ventricle. So the floor is made up of the rhomboid fossa, as you can see. Then we have superiorly the superior velum, inferiorly the inferior velum, and then laterally, which is not really shown here, it's bordered by the cerebellar peduncles. And as we already said, the 4th ventricle is the last. So after this ventricle, the cerebrospinal fluid then goes on to the spinal cord through the central canal, and it goes on to the brain through the subarachnoid space. So now that we talked about each ventricle, we can talk about the whole process of production, circulation, and clearance of liquor as a whole. So first, we're talking about production. How is the CSF produced? We already said that it's produced in the ventricles, but you need to know what specifically is it called. So within the ventricles, we have a vascularized plexus that's called the choroid plexus, and this is what produces the CSF or liquor. And for the clearance of liquor, it's cleared out through some granulations called subarachnoid granulations, and this clears out into the dural venous sinuses. So now that we know how it's produced and how it's cleared out, we can talk about the whole process as a whole. So if we start from the lateral ventricles, the fluid then goes to through the interventricular foramen of Monro into the 3rd ventricle, then through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius into the 4th ventricle. From there, it goes through the central canal to the spinal cord, and then it goes to the subarachnoid spaces to bathe the brain through 3 apertures. 1 median aperture and 2 lateral apertures. The median aperture is also called Magendi's foramen, and the 2 lateral apertures are also called Luschka's foramina. So as we said, it goes on to the subarachnoid space, and finally it's cleared out through the subarachnoid granulations into the dural venous sinus. So that's it. And lastly, the last topic we have to talk about is the clinical aspect of the whole circulation of liquor. So this is hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus is a condition where you have an abnormal collection of cerebrospinal fluid in the ventricular system. And this obviously is dangerous because it causes an increased intracranial pressure. So now that we talked about the whole process of production, circulation, and clearance of CSF, if you think about it, this could be due to 3 main causes. So it could be due to an increased production of CSF, a reduced clearance of CSF, or if there's a blockage in the ventricular system. So based on this, we classify hydrocephalus into 2 main types. We have communicating and non-communicating. Communicating or non-obstructive hydrocephalus means that there's an abnormal collection of CSF without any obstructions. So that means it's either due to an increased production of CSF or a decreased clearance of the CSF. And then the second type is non-communicating or obstructive CSF. So that means there's a physical obstruction of the pathway through the ventricles. This is usually in the aqueduct of Sylvius because it's a very narrow point. And that's it. Thank you guys and good luck with your exams.